Welcome back. My name is Sam Hassel, and in today's episode, we are going to discuss the one elite college that you may regret not visiting, right? So, what is it? Well, the answer is Auburn. So, that is it for today's podcast, and we'll talk to you in the next episode. Bye bye. Of course, I'm kidding. So, this elite college to which I am referring is not any specific college, but it is a college with a very specific type of decision plan, right? And so, on this podcast, we have spoken a lot about the importance of early decision, how it gives you a very significant boost to your odds of admission, why it's a very honest signal to a college in terms of your intent to enroll. And given that colleges are very protective over their yields, and even many top colleges only have about 50 to 60% of students that they extend offers to who actually accept their offers of admission. Being able to put in a binding commitment at least controls for one very critical variable in terms of the matching process, right, between a college and a student. It is really the one of the only factors in terms of how colleges admit students that you potentially can 100% control because there's all sorts of other variants in terms of institutional priorities and your hook and your major and your background and who's going to be in the applicant pool and pretty much the other factors that drive your candidacy you can't 100% control, right? But when it comes to this variable of your intent to enroll, it is actually one of the few variables that goes into the decision making that you do actually have absolute control over. Now, of course, there are caveats, there are potentially financial situations, right? We won't get into that, but ED does allow the students who are able to submit a commitment, it does allow them to control one very critical variable in the admissions equation. To a lesser extent, there are some other decision plans that have, a little bit of benefits or boost to them as well. So you have single choice early action, and that can provide a bit of a boost. It sort of varies, by the specific college. It may not be as big of a boost at, for example, Stanford as it is at Yale, and so it sort of depends. But ED is going to be the only ones in single choice early action, restrictive early action, some of these other plans, even early action. You cannot get nearly as big of a boost because you're not signaling your absolute intent and commitment to enroll. That being said, we have ED, but what happens if you don't get into either your ED1 school or you don't get into your single choice early action school, right? So the single choice early action schools, there are five of them: Harvard, Stanford, Yale, Princeton, and Caltech. There are two restrictive early action schools, Georgetown and Notre Dame. And then we have a whole bunch of ED schools. But if you don't get into, we'll just say your first choice early school, it could be ED, it could be ED1, it could be single choice early action. It could be restrictive early action. What do you sort of do from there, right? And you want to sort of be able to see, I often say on the podcast, you want to, in many ways, now, not in every way, sometimes people do this and they try to reverse engineer something that doesn't need to be reverse engineered, or it's actually not helpful in a certain given task or in a certain aspect. But generally speaking, being able to reverse engineer the process is generally going to be helpful to be able to see the end, before you start or along the way, right? And so at this point in time, as we're sort of in December of 2025 here, right? We sort of have two different cohorts, right? We have the seniors who are getting all of their early decisions back, whether it's ED, single choice early action, EA, restrictive early action, whatever it is. Then you have the juniors who generally should be about to start their college visits, right? Sort of a year behind the seniors, right? And they should now be embarking upon the college visit journey and starting to see visits, generally starting with the February break and then going into spring break, etc. What would behoove most of the juniors, and this episode is primarily for the juniors who are about to embark on the visits, but certainly for anybody else as well. On your visits, you want to be potentially identifying what that ED school is going to be for those who can afford to and are amenable to putting in a binding commitment to significantly increase their odds of admission. But what you also have to be able to see, in addition to that, is you have to be able to see the situation that the seniors, some of the seniors, not all of them, but many of them, are currently going to be going through, right? Which is we know what the early round acceptance rates are at many of the top and most highly selected colleges that we focus this podcast on, right? Many of those acceptance rates for those early plans, you have the very low end of something like an MIT has about a 5% EA acceptance rate, right? Then you have some of the other sort of classic top 5 schools. You have the Harvards, the Yales, the Stanfords, and we know some of those rates are gonna be around sort of high single digits, we'll say roughly 10%. You have, some sort of, quote, unquote, "mid-Ivies," and you have your sort of, Penns and Columbias are gonna sort of maybe be in that 10 to 14% range. You have your Dukes are gonna be somewhere around 14%. We don't have all these stats yet for the most recent application cycle, and these decisions are still rolling out. But generally speaking, for most of the top colleges that have an early round, most of the most competitive, highly selective colleges, you're roughly talking about 7 out of every 8 applicants are going to either be denied or be deferred in the early round, right? So it's the vast majority of students will not be admitted in the early round. And then if you take out all the students who are, recruited athletes and other special cases, the net is even worse than that. We can sort of say just by doing the math, the vast majority of students, right? Certainly great. If you got in, congratulations, right? Congratulations to anybody this year, past years, all future generations, potentially listening to this. That's certainly great if you got accepted. But what do you do if you don't get into your top choice early school? It's a very unfortunate situation, and it's also unfortunate because many students, they don't want to do a lot of the extra application work until they hear back from, and I hope none of you do this or are doing this, because it's a really bad situation to be in. But what will happen is certain students won't want to do the rest of all of their college applications and all their school-specific supplements, of which there will be many, 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 many dozens, potentially, when you're applying to a lot of highly selective colleges. They don't wanna do them. It would be, inefficient, right? So they don't wanna do the rest of the school supplements until after they've heard back from their top choice school. The problem with that is you're now basically going to be in an absolute frenzy for the 2 weeks between hearing back from your early school, your top choice early school around middle of December, where we are right now, and the rest of the deadlines, whether they early decision 2 or regular decision, which are going to be all around January 1st. They might be the 5th, the 3rd, but they're roughly all going to be about 2.5 weeks after you hear back from your early school. Ideally, you're not in that situation, or ideally, you do not want to put yourself in that situation as you're absolutely scrambling. But in addition to all of the potential work, if you are in that situation, on top of that, you now have this very difficult situation whereby you're trying to sort of read the tea leaves. Did you got deferred? What does this deferral mean? Is it meaningful? Do I still have a chance at this school? And we do have an episode on this, which we released not too long ago, called The Truth About Early Decision and Deferrals, where we discuss this much more in length, the sort of reasoning process. What does it mean if you're deferred? And the answer is it depends a lot by the specific college, right? Some colleges just defer everyone. Some colleges are very conservative. And so if you've been deferred, that could be a meaningful signal that you have a higher probability of success versus just any regular decision applicant in the regular decision rounds, right? However, it's hard to sort of parse some of these signals. You're going to be submitting different applications and different application components because no application is exactly the same. Just because one school maybe deferred you and that may be as meaningful at that school, another school doesn't necessarily have the same institutional priorities. It's very hard to sort of decipher some of these sort of signals. You have these different, sort of potential outcomes. Now, if you're rejected, it's very clear. You have to move on. right? The deferral is the one that is very tricky and trips a lot of people up. As I said, it can be very unfortunate because some people will not be able to let go of that top choice school, and they will not do something which we're going to talk about, which is early decision two, and maybe they should have done early decision two, but they can't let go of the deferral at the top choice school. They have to see it through. So they don't do ED2. They would have gotten into the ED2 school, which is, ideally their second or third choice, right? And then they end up getting into neither their first choice school. They don't get into school they would have done ED2. And who knows what happens, right? In some cases, a small number of cases, they will end up, they might have been deferred and they do actually end up getting into that school in the regular decision round. That's going to be a very small percentage of cases, 10% or lower. Maybe, they don't do ED2 at the other school, but they get into that school in the regular decision round. It's not likely. It's certainly not the probability, but it could happen. The most probable case is their candidacy is now going to fall, whether it falls to their number 4 school, whether it falls to their number 8 school, whether it falls to their number 12 school. We don't really know. It depends on, the specific candidacy, but there's going to be a distribution of outcomes. And some people will be totally fine. That's going to be, a smaller percentage. And then a lot of people they will actually potentially slip. This is very case specific. And there are people where they're sort of like, I got deferred from this. Should I do ED2? And it's like, you can't answer these questions in a vacuum, right? You have to know the student's candidacy very specifically. You need to know the schools in question very specifically. You need to understand the deferral rates. Understand what the ED2 options are, potentially are. You need to understand what those admission rates are. People like to ask a lot of these very generic questions that cannot be answered accurately without a ton of specific context. I'm not gonna sit here and say, "Oh, if you got deferred, then you should do ED2." It's like I have no idea, right? No context for your candidacy. Did you make mistakes that could be changed or improved? Is there who knows? There's a million different variables in terms of your background and your particular candidacy. But that being said, you at least want to have optionality, right? You probably don't want to have the situation occur whereby, and again, this is going to be, I'm not trying to be cynical or negative. It is just a mathematical statistical fact that somewhere around 7 out of 8 students and most of these highly selective colleges do not get in the early round. It is just the reality of the situation that most do not get in, and most are going to be in this situation where they have been either rejected or deferred, and they need to sort of, in these 2 weeks, sort of say, okay, what's next? The predicament that you don't want to be in is you have already limited your options because of earlier decisions or actions that you made or that you took or that you didn't make or that you didn't take. And so if we sort of reverse from the situation that many seniors will find themselves in at this point, whereas they didn't get into one of these top colleges and they have these 2 weeks. Well, do you want to potentially have a second shot at early decision? A second shot, maybe you didn't, and again, maybe you didn't even do early decision in the first round. Maybe you didn't do it at all. Maybe you did some EA. Maybe you're holding out for, MIT, whatever it was. Maybe you just didn't have your stuff together. I mean, very unlikely. There aren't a ton of students, I'll put it this way, who do ED2 who didn't apply. They just sort of just because they didn't have their stuff together in time. That usually is not doesn't tend to happen very often. But whatever the case is, maybe you did single choice early action, maybe you were deferred, maybe you were rejected, whatever it is, you probably would prefer to at least have the option. I'm not saying that you need to use it, but you probably would like to at least have the optionality of some ED2s in your back pocket at this point in time in senior year with 2 weeks left to make a potentially very high stakes decision that could determine your admissions fate and whether you go to potentially your number 2 school or you go to your number 11 school, right? And again, we don't know, right? It could be, you don't do ED2, you go to number 8. It's just like we don't know, right? It's very contextual, right? But what we do probably know is as long as you have the ability to do ED2, you probably would want that to be an option, right? You would probably most people prefer to have more options versus fewer options, right? And particularly if you're coming out of getting a negative admissions decision, it can be very consoling to sort of know you have another good shot, another crack at it before you just get to the regular decision rounds. And we've talked about the madness that is the regular decision rounds and the admissions rate just falling through the floor at most top colleges, right? This is where you end up in mid single digits, low single digits. You end up with 3% acceptance rates, 4% acceptance rates, 5% acceptance rates, whatever it is, it sort of can be a very precipitous drop off. We've also talked a lot about some of the strategic liabilities of being in the regular decision rounds, right? You're now no longer one of the first applicants that they've reviewed. You don't get as much review time. You're much more subject to your major or your hook having already been seen. It's not as novel. Those departments or those majors are already more full. They already have more of that class filled up. And so it's a lot more subject to variance in the applicant pool. And we talked about this in a recent episode. You're a student, you're interested in environmental themes. These are very popular. It's like, it's a lot more risky in the regular decision round versus when they're building the class from ground zero. Particularly, again, if you're in very oversubscribed or very competitive areas, can be particularly risky. It's not that you can't get in regular decision. And again, we know these for the people who sort of try to make these arguments of, don't do the ED2 or don't. It's like, again, I can't give any advice because I don't even know who you are and I don't even know your candidacy, right? So I can't possibly give any recommendations or say, oh, got deferred, you should do it, you shouldn't do it. It's like, who knows? Right. This is why we do very specific case studies, because it takes things that are very generic and very abstract and decontextualize, and it makes them much more contextualized, right? Because we actually have an actual case to discuss and to advise. But we do know, right, that in the regular decision round at most of these top colleges, we know what the math is, right? We know that about 95%, 95% will not get in the regular decision round. And if you sort of add all of these schools up, we presented this figure in one of our admissions master classes, and this has to be calibrated obviously to the student's case and to what the very specific schools are. But just as a ballpark figure for many people, if you are talking about highly selective colleges, so we're going to say a college that has about a 5% RD acceptance rate, as many of the highly selective colleges do. Right now, there's some schools that have like an 8% or a 10%, but there are also some schools that have a 3%, right? If we just sort of use 5% as a very round number, right, for a highly selective college, even if you throw in 15, you throw your hat into the ring 15 times, right? You sort of do what they call shotgunning. You do 15 RD schools that are highly selective colleges. I'm not talking about targets or safeties, right? Because odds are if you're listening to this podcast, you probably don't want to go to your safety or, your target school. And I'm talking about target in the sense of, you could be a school that is highly selective, could actually be a target for your particular candidacy. But I'm using that more in the sense of it's probably not as highly competitive or highly selective. Most people who are applying to highly selective colleges want to go to a highly selective college, or if you're listening to this podcast, you probably are listening to this because you want to go to a very good school and a school that is highly selective, right? So I'm focusing on those schools in the registration round. If we have a 5% chance, it's like if I said to you, okay, great, give me all of your money. I'll give you some payoff. Obviously, the numbers would depend. And you have a 5% chance of making more money, or you might lose it all. But it's like, I'll give you 15 of them, right? You probably wouldn't be that optimistic because each of those shots has a 5% chance of coming through right now. Whether these are independent events or dependent, we won't get into all the logic. We've sort of run some of the math. And for the average applicant who takes about 15 shots in the regular decision round, the average applicant, right, who takes about 15 shots in the regular decision round at highly selective colleges, you have about a 60 to 70% chance of getting rejected by all of them. And so a lot of people have this sort of false sense of confidence or this complacency due to the large number of shots they can take. But you need to keep in mind that you might have a large number of these shots, but each of the shots is a very low chance of coming through. And again, what your particular probabilities are going to depend. You're not likely the average, right? And so it's going to depend case by case, but it is highly risky, the regular decision round, right? And so you probably would ideally like to have at least some optionality. Whether you actually utilize it or don't utilize it is sort of up to you. But the situation you don't want to find yourself in is during junior year or, any years, you didn't go see schools that have early decision two, and now you haven't gone into your ED1 school or your signatures early action school or your restrictive early action school or your early action school, right? You haven't gone in, but you now didn't do the visit for the schools that have early decision two. And so you don't even have any information. You're certainly not going to put in a binding commitment. I mean, well, I won't say certainly because there are students who do actually do this. They do actually put in binding commitment for a school they've never visited before, but it's a small minority, right? For most people, they generally do not put in a binding commitment to a school they've never seen before, generally speaking. You're probably not going to be able to do ED2 if you haven't even seen the school, right? And you're not going to be able, in typical cases, the colleges are also generally shut down over the winter break. You're not going to be able to do this in 2 weeks. You have a ton of applications, so you don't want to find yourself in that position, right? The very unfortunate position where not only are you potentially really scrambling to finish all of your applications and do a great job for these regular decision schools, but then you have this very difficult sort of decision making of, what do you do now? What does the deferral mean? What does rejection mean? Is your application fundamentally flawed? Like, you're trying to interpret this, you don't have any. It's not like the admissions officers send you, constructive criticism as to what went wrong with your application. You don't get any of that, right? There are people who change their approach when there might not actually have been anything wrong with their approach. They just maybe weren't at the degree of scarcity that gets into that level of school. It's not there's something fundamentally wrong. They may get into another school. There might be some different institutional priorities. Whatever it is, you're also going to potentially have different essays, the different components, there are different requirements for different applications. I generally have never heard most people talk about this, that each application is different, right? They might talk about different institutional priorities, but very rarely do people talk about the fact that almost no two applications look exactly the same. If you're applying to a UC versus, Vanderbilt, well, the UCs don't require any letters of recommendation. So that's not something they would have in your file. If you have amazing rec letters and you're applying to Vanderbilt and you can put two of those rec letters in your file, would that potentially change your odds? I'm not saying it's going to necessarily be the difference, but they are fundamentally evaluating different information. I've never really heard anybody talk about this, that the applications are fundamentally different between different institutions. One school might give you 5 essay questions, right? Another school might give you 2 supplements. It's possible that you crush a question and have an amazing answer for one of them, but that's not on the application for one school whereas it is for another school. And so it's very case specific, right? There's all these complexities. People change something when they shouldn't have actually have changed it. In some cases, they don't change it, right? It's like you need information. You need information before you go and change things, right? And you're not going to get it from the admissions officers and from the college. So it's a very ambiguous period, right? It's a very hard, situation. We don't need to make it harder by having shot ourselves in the foot and not having seen schools well in advance because we sort of saw the future, right? Well in advance, we planned for these contingencies. We don't need to make our lives even harder by not having some contingency plans here, right? So if you're particularly a junior, or even if you're younger, you can obviously flag this, right? You would ideally like to at least have ED2 optionality in your back pocket. Whether you use it or not, right, is a different situation, but you probably would prefer to have more options. You probably would prefer to have more moves on the board versus fewer moves on the board if you end up in this situation, right? So if you sort of reverse engineer, we probably want to be able to have an ED2 in our back pocket. I'm going to sort of go through some of the different colleges that offer ED2. Now, when we're talking about top and highly selective colleges, we generally talk about the top 20 or so national research universities. That generally sort of tends to be how most people define it. It's a little bit ambiguous. It could be top 25, it could be top 30. You have very competitive and selective liberal arts colleges as well, right? You have Pomona, you have Amherst, you have Williams, a lot of these other very competitive. They tend not to be as highly selective as the main name brand national research universities, but they are still highly selective. But from roughly the, sort of top 20, top 25, I'm going to give some notable colleges that have early decision too. A lot of colleges do not have early decision too, right? We know that their top colleges don't even have early decision. MIT doesn't even have a restrictive or single choice plan. It's just regular early action. We have, Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, Yale don't have early decision. They have single choice early action, same as with Caltech. And so your options are going to be limited, right? In terms of how many schools, a lot of schools don't even have ED. There could be schools that don't even have, that don't have ED2, right? They might have ED, but they don't have ED2. So the main name brand, I'm going to mostly focus on national research universities, the big names that have ED2. So first one is Chicago. The second one is Johns Hopkins. The third one is Rice, which just introduced its ED2 plan last year. Number four is Vanderbilt. Then we have WashU, we have Emory, and then for another one, not typically considered sort of a top 20, but still a pretty big name brand national research university, is NYU, is another notable one. So we have those schools: Chicago, Johns Hopkins, Rice, Vanderbilt, WashU, Emory, and NYU are some of the big name brand highly selective colleges that have an early decision two plan, right? And again, when you're talking about a very limited sample, you're just going to have a limited sample size in terms of your optionality for doing ED2. Some other schools that are maybe a little bit, sort of less quote unquote, sort of maybe highly ranked or as highly selective. You have BU, Boston University, you have Boston College. Those both have ED1 and ED2. You have Tufts has ED2. And then you have some name brand liberal arts colleges that have ED2 as well. You have Swarthmore, you have Pomona, and so you do have some of those colleges as well. If you are a junior or you have a junior or you want to think about this a little bit preemptively, one of the benefits beyond sort of just having this potential contingency plan where you've already done these visits to schools that have ED2, and you potentially now will have that contingency plan if you don't get into your first choice early school, and you now are not going to be freaking out nearly as much, and you will feel a little bit more confident because now you do know you have a second shot at it. You have another high leverage move on the board, right, where you can signal absolute commitment to attending the university. In addition to that, which is, of course, something that you ideally would like to have in general, what seeing in these ED2 schools allows you to do, or having ED2, and we saw this in some of the application case studies over the summer, particularly the second students who was potentially, considering some riskier EDs like doing a Brown. What this allows you to do, having an ED2, is it allows you to potentially take a little bit more risk on your first choice early school, right? And so it is often the case that if we sort of look at a student's candidacy and we say their first choice early school, we're looking at those first choice early schools. It might be that it's erring to being too risky. But if we can sort of say, hey, we can backstop the risk of this first choice school and we have another ED2 behind it, and even ideally another maybe, like third choice school that they have and this is very hard. It's very hard to have like a third choice school, because if it's not ED, it's just going, again, you're dealing with very high variance, and a much higher degree of applicants in those pools. And so it's very hard to have a third choice school that's a non-ED. For some people, it could be, it would have been historically something like a Michigan early action. We could sort of say, a student, might really like, a Michigan or, maybe UVA. It's still very variant, because it wasn't binding. It's a huge applicant pool. You still deal with sort of, enrollment management and yield protection. And so it's still not very definitive, but there would be some schools like a Michigan where you could sort of say, hey, if this is their third choice school, you have a higher degree of predictability for the Michigan EA historically in the past than you would for, a regular decision school. Nowadays, with now Michigan having introduced early decision, that EA to Michigan, you can count on it a lot less because now they would have accepted non-trivial number of students in the early decision round, right? And so it's even a little bit more risky because whereas the EA students would have been first, they would have been the first students who were accepted. Now they're in the second cohort of students who are accepted, right? And so I'm just giving an example, right? Michigan may not actually be a fair choice school, but it's an example of a school where it at least had a reasonable degree of predictability if that happened to be your third choice school, right? And it wasn't that you were behind any other applicants in terms of being behind them and doing early decision, right? Whereas now it actually is going forward. If you do have a third choice, right, this is kind of becoming a lot more sort of a fanciful notion in reality. But if you did theoretically have a third choice that we felt pretty good about in terms of your odds of admission, that you felt good about going to, then that would further backstop the risk on a little bit of a riskier ED1 or whatever it is for first choice early school, right? I think this is all conceptually pretty simple. And so for students who don't go to see potential colleges that have ED2 during their visits, you potentially lose the optionality of that if you don't get into your first choice early school, but you also potentially you lose some potential optionality to maybe take a little bit of some more risk on that ED school as well, right? And so it's a very I sort of call an ED2 school like a linchpin school. It's a form of a linchpin school, where it plays a very pivotal role, and people might be very caught up in what the first choice early school is, but they don't actually understand that ED2 having an ED2 as a backup could provide you the air cover to take a shot at that first choice school or one of your other top choice schools, right? And so it plays a very critical strategic role in this process and sort of this game of dominoes. It's just something that many people should really ideally, if you can do ED, and you're amenable to doing ED, as I've said many times, if you have the financial wherewithal to do ED, it is a major strategic advantage, right, for most applicants. And as I've said many times, I'm not trying to be negative or overly cynical. I'm not trying to rub it in people's faces, but I'm just telling you, and we did a recent episode, right, on what it takes for some of these top five, these single choice early action schools. Now there are some people who financially, they're in the situation where they can only do, they're going to take a shot at one of the single choice early action schools because it's not binding and they have to see all of their offers, right? And all the scholarship opportunities. And that's a different case, right? For the people, a lot of the people, and again, it depends. Show me your application. I'll tell you whether you're viable for single choice early action to a top five school or not, right? It will become very simple at that point in time. But generally speaking, I can say that the number of people who are competitive for highly selective college versus the number of people who are competitive for one of those five or so single choice early action schools, it is a significant fall off, right? Many people go after the single choice early action plans and they're not at that tier of candidate. And we discussed this in a recent episode. There's a major difference between a student who gets into a top 20, top 25 school and a student who gets into a school such as Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, MIT, Caltech, right? That level of school. And it's still non-trivial the difference between those six schools that I just named and sort of even some of the mid-Ivies or a Columbia or a Penn or a Brown or etc. And so you end up with these potentially very weird risk reward imbalances because the risk becomes really very significant if you're talking about opportunity costs on the early plans. But if your upside is very marginal in terms of how you view one of these schools, Columbia versus a Stanford, the risk reward becomes significantly out of whack where you are getting a major amount of uncompensated risk. You're inheriting a ton of risk for a very marginal amount of upside, and many people fall into that trap, unfortunately. One of the things to understand when we're talking about these highly selective colleges and top colleges is the ceiling is capped, right? There is not a school that is 10 times better than another top college. Unless again, you're just some special snowflake and you think every other top college is a 1 out of 10 and Stanford's a 10 out of 10, right? But this just usually doesn't happen. However, even though the ceiling is capped, there's very diminishing returns when you're already talking about highly selective colleges in terms of you going to this highly selective college versus you going to that highly selective college. The floor is limitless, right? There is no guarantee that you get into any college whatsoever, and I literally mean no college. There's no guarantee unless you do something like, like direct admit or something where it's like very obvious, it's just based on your metrics and you can automatically get it. But again, in a lot of the cases, the schools where you could sort of see yourself as obviously getting in, or where that's a true safety school, for a lot of people, that's not the school they want to go to, right? And the school that they typically want to go to is one of the highly selective colleges. And for those schools, you have absolutely no assurances that you're going to get in, right? The floor is, like I said, 15 top colleges, average student has about a 60 to 70% chance of missing on all of them, right? And so the floor, there's a huge asymmetry where the ceiling is highly capped. There are very marginal differences between the top colleges in terms of the ceiling, but the floor might fall out from you entirely, right? Which is you don't get into any of them, right? It's just the reality of the situation, and it's not me just like making this up. It is statistically supported. You do really need to think about this well in advance. Like I say many times, you need to see the end before you start, or you need to be able to see the end as you start getting a lot closer to the end, which is for juniors who are coming up on the application process and doing their college visits. You need to be able to put yourself in the shoes of students when they're making their ED1 decisions or their first choice early schools. Do I have some, can I hedge the risk here? Can I backstop the risk? Right? If this first domino falls, do I have something behind it? Again, potentially, if you are going to be taking a little bit more risk on your candidacy up front with the first choice school. But then you also, again, if you should you find yourself in this situation, and again, statistically, this is the situation most people find themselves in, is they will not get into that first choice highly selective college in the middle of December. You potentially want this assurance and you don't want to regret not having seen these ED2 schools potentially while you still have the chance, because then you will not have the information off of which to potentially put in a binding commitment, right? Which means you will lose that optionality, right? You don't want to be kicking yourself down the line. Again, if you don't have any intention of doing early decision or you don't want to do it, again, whatever, you do you, and that's your particular situation. This is always a use if useful sort of situation with anything I say. And again, I don't have a student's case right in front of me. And so this is a bit decontextualized, but I think everybody could sort of understand why these ED2 schools play a potentially very significant strategic role in the process. And they are your last resort for many students before you get to the regular decision, for lack of a better term, bloodbath, right? Now, it will be a bloodbath for you. I don't know. I don't know you. It could be totally fine, right? But you understand what the odds are in the regular decision round, and they're not great, right? They're not great in general. If you're talking about highly selective colleges, as I said, roughly 7 out of 8 will not get into their first choice highly selective college in the early round, but it gets way worse from there. It's just a little bit of me painting some caveats here for people and explaining the logic of why this could play a very significant strategic role in your process. It could be your last resort before the regular season round. It could really be extremely helpful to your candidacy and play a very crucial strategic role, as I've said. Now, one little caveat going a little bit in the other direction, right? As I sort of had presented this picture of you can use an ED2 to backstop some of the risk. The first choice school, I do want to put some asterisks here, and we've mentioned this on some other podcasts. You do also need to understand, though, the ED2 rates do drop non-trivially from the ED1 rates, right? Most colleges do not give you ED2 acceptance rates. It's fairly uncommon to publish them. A rough, very just arbitrary, just to like put a little bit of meat on the point. is you might be talking about something like it getting cut in half, right? So if the ED acceptance rate for a college were 20%, the ED1 acceptance rate were 20% at your first shot, the ED2 acceptance rate, you can maybe say might be 10%, but it's still a heck of a lot better than 4%, right? In the registration round, right? You're talking about, again, would you prefer to go in a room with 10 people and one of them walks out, or you prefer to go into a room with 25 people and 24 of them don't walk out, only one of them walks out? You probably would prefer the room with only 10 people, not 25, where one of them walks out. It still is a non-trivial boost. There are other reasons that I won't get into as to why the ED2 rates might be lower. You're dealing with a biased sample of students who already didn't get into another highly selective college, right? And so that's also you could attribute potentially some of the lower rates to that as well, right? This is why I always say you have to sort of know the specific case and be able to analyze it correctly. The ED2 rates do fall off quite precipitously, but it is still going to be an advantage versus the regular decision rounds, right? Or, EA potentially. It also is still fundamentally, regardless of what the acceptance rate is still fundamentally an honest signal and a guaranteed signal to the college that you are coming. And that still is, again, it's really the only variable in the admissions pie that you have absolute control over. Almost everything else you don't have control over, right? You don't have 100% control over, right? It's really the only part of the acceptance equation or the admissions criteria that you can fully control. That's why it's also important as well. But you do have to understand I don't want to encourage people, to take way too much risk on the first choice early school because they're get this false sense of complacency that the ED2 is going to be their full-fledged safety blanket. You do have to understand that the ED2 rates do also go down, but they are still a lot better. It's still a lot better to have an ED2 school than to just go into the regular decision round, all else being equal. And again, it depends on your particular case. It is going to give you a non-trivially better shot than the regular decision round in most cases. Okay, that is it for this episode on ED2 schools, the importance of having them, the importance of visiting them, and potentially putting them into your contingency plan. Should you face the situation in senior year whereby you don't get into your first choice early school, or also just for the sort of decision making that goes into your ED1 school or your first choice early school in the first place, knowing that you have the school behind it could give you a little bit of a buffer. So that is it for this episode. Hopefully this was helpful to everyone, and we will talk soon in the next one. We will be on break for a couple of weeks for a winter break, but after that we'll be back at it in the new year in 2026 with some more episodes. So happy holidays to everyone and best of luck to everyone, the seniors and whatnot, with the remainder of your applications. Bye bye. We'll talk soon in the next episode.